Her mother was a Pentecostal preacher, and as such, Newton was surrounded by faith forever. This comes out in her writing, especially in When the Flock Changed, an excerpt from her novel In Progress, for which she received the Narrative Prize from Narrative Magazine in 2009. Maud Newton attended the University of Florida and studied writing, eventually going to law school and becoming an attorney. She has since become a full-time writer. Her other writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Hall, Tin House, Narrative Magazine, and the Paris Review Daily, among others. Long before Tumblr, Twitter, and even MySpace were created, Maud Newton had her own literary blog. Created in 2002, MaudNewton.com addresses all things literary, from brief biographical snippets about writers to book reviews of everything from Kingsley Amis to Thomas Pynchon. The research she does for her blog is astounding. Amis's first editor, Hilary Rubenstein, found it implausible that the protagonist of Lucky Jim could drink 10 pints of beer at the pub in a single evening. But that, as John Banville observes in a new introduction to Amis's The Old Devils, was before he had met the author in person. MaudNewton.com has the accessibility of a blog, but the form of a small magazine. In her fiction, Newton allows her own experience to come out so succinctly, one might debate the fictionality of it. In Regarding the Insurance Defense Attorney, Newton creates a third-person narrative that implicates so much about the subject, the female defense attorney, without ever getting inside her head. Why, today of all days, would the insurance defense attorney wear a thong or perhaps no underwear at all, when it is so important to look respectful? When the smell of her boss's cologne suddenly seems overpowering, does the insurance defense attorney wonder for the second time that day if she is pregnant? Newton's language is so sharp, and her life experiences seep through almost imperceptibly into fiction. Given that Newton has claimed to use her own experiences in her fiction, one can assume that Regarding the Insurance Defense Attorney comes at least in part from her experience as an attorney. Maud Newton knows everything that has happened to her and everything that she used to be. She doesn't poke fun at herself or the people in her life for cheap entertainment, but studies the way her characters interact with their surroundings, covering the little ironies that we miss in our day-to-day. In our discussion of Newton's work, Connor Wood had this to say. Her writing weaves subtle beauty with realistic attention, following a phrase like, Isaiah was a lone bird crying out in the wilderness of otherwise blessed silence, with the acquiescent punctuation of, my bedroom is on the other side of the house. I didn't get too worked up about it. It's risky to do what Maud Newton does, to write about herself and then turn what she's already written as nonfiction into fiction, risky on both personal and artistic levels. But this dual thread of material from her own life has created a body of work that is rich and rewarding for her readers. Please welcome Maud Newton.
That was so nice and thoughtful, Tori. Thank you. So I've been working on this novel for a really long time, and it's changed a lot over time. It's become more and more narrow, which I think is good. So I'm going to read you the prologue and part of the first chapter as they stand now, and they may change later on. The book is called Fervor. My mother was the last to see him. As Hurricane Andrew churned across the Atlantic and Miamians raced around buying water and canned goods and plywood to nail over windows, my stepfather's buddies broke ranks, deciding that keeping the secret of his whereabouts was less urgent than saving his life. Word spread through the Coconut Grove grapevine until it reached Freddie Acevedo, who had never been part of Luke's gang, but did have our phone number and maybe even some residual affection for us. He called Mom from the payphone outside Big Daddy's on Berg before the weather got bad to let her know for the first time in 2 years where she could find her husband. Abandoning her own preparations, leaving 200 caged birds still shrieking on the back porch, Mom drove through the rain into Peacock Park and made her way beneath the dipping palms and swaying banyans to the marina. Apart from a few stragglers loading sailboats onto trailers, the vista was strangely empty. All the yachts had gone north or been hauled out and dry docked. Everything portable had been removed or tied down. Luke's boat stood rocking amid the battered hulls of 2 others, its blue paint worn away, its deck strewn with trash, its mast broken and whipping in 2 pieces in the wind. Freddie waved to her, spat on the ground, offered some perfunctory greeting, He was one of many who'd left her church after the dorms burned down, and he had not been in touch since. As arranged, she gave him $100 to ferry her out to the abandoned houseboat where Luke was living and to return in a half hour to ride them back to shore. They didn't speak as the sputtering motorboat made its way across the water. When they reached Luke's rickety heap of a vessel, Freddie helped my mother onto the deck. The ancient teak flooring, what she could see of it in the path through the garbage at least, was so pockmarked and mossy with rot, she was afraid to make her way to the door. Once she did, she stood pounding her fist against it for quite some time before Luke emerged, shirtless, filthy, and deathly skinny, like a skeleton crammed into the hide of a slightly larger man who'd spent too much time in the sun. His eyelids drooped over two milky blue marbles and the purple half-moons beneath them. Rashy bruises ran down both arms. Even his long red gold mane, which he'd always at least kept combed with his fingers, was matted and dull. Squinting, he lifted a hand as if to shade his eyes, but couldn't raise it that far and let it fall back to his side. Once he recognized my mother, though, his face transformed into that big, bright smile that I loved basking in, the gap-toothed grin that warmed everyone right to the core. He was a mess, but he was still himself. His old colleague, Cassie, as if to vouch for this, panted at his side. My mother invited him to go home with her. He said no. She urged him to leave the boat at least and let her drop him with friends inland. Gently, he declined. Finally, she offered to give him the car outright and find another ride home. Marilyn, he said, still smiling at her, you know I ain't got a license. In desperation, she commanded him and his demons to go. Cheerfully, he refused. I'll be just fine, he said. He'd grown up on the Gulf Coast, he reminded her. He knew how to ride out a storm. Mom was weary, past throwing things and screaming, past forcible interventions and impromptu exorcisms. Her charisma was waning, or at least her confidence was shaken, which for an evangelical preacher, especially an out-of-work one, is essentially the same thing. It was partly my fault. I'd recently become infamous for crusading on behalf of the opposite of everything she'd ever taught me. It made for a good story, even if some of it wasn't true. Bible thumper's daughter goes off to college, falls under thrall of Northeastern liberal, becomes a church-burning Satanist. My boyfriend and I were released from custody just days before the storm bore down. At the time, I was furious with my mother, absolutely consumed with fiery rage toward her, but it makes my heart hurt now to think of her standing there on the ship in her pastor guise, straining against the wind and blinking back tears, pleading with Luke to vacate. In so many ways, she was generous, lively, fun, and flexible. My earliest friend, my original co-conspirator, one of the funniest people I've ever known, and yet she could also be so rigid, so literal. Don't ever feel you've crossed a line you can't retreat from, she had told Luke when he left us. After all, Moses murdered a man, and then he'd walked into the night and disappeared for 2 years. Within the logic of what she believed, I guess there really was nothing my mother could do that day on the broken-down houseboat but pray. So she laid hands on Luke, and she left behind her Bible and a Kenneth Copeland cassette. And as Freddie's boat coughed back to shore, the surf so choppy, he checked the latches on her life preserver. She thought she could hear Copeland singing over the wind. You've got to keep on casting your bread upon the water. It's going to come back home on every wave. 4 days later, Luke's body washed up in a canal with sweet, mangy Cassie still tethered to his leg with a leash. No one who knew him in his last years was surprised things ended this way. Well, no one except me. I was incandescent, full of blame for myself and for everyone, that especially for my mother, she herself seemed resigned. The Lord's protection for sinners, she reckoned, ran only so far. Okay, and now I'm going to read a little bit of the first chapter. Luke came into our lives the way he died, like driftwood, moving toward us, whirling away, sweeping back again. In one of those impossible coincidences of timing that seem like something out of a Victorian novel, I met him the day my own father died. People assume this twist of happenstance was significant in ways it was not, that rather than grieving, I displaced my natural affection for my father onto a young, troubled man who happened to be there. In fact, I had been waiting my whole short life for a father I could love in the way I loved Luke. I was a babyish girl on the verge of 13, inwardly defiant, outwardly docile, a secret insomniac who wore gingham nightgowns actually made for an 8-year-old. After my parents put me to bed, I hid out in my closet, reading and worrying for hours. My greatest fear, apart from my father's wrath, was being damned to hell, which could happen for any sin, no matter how small. And the story that Corey read a little bit from, called Regarding the Insurance Defense Attorney, was also on that website. And so I started out there. There were other sites that I liked, writers I was discovering who were doing exciting stuff online, I thought. And it seemed like a world that I might be able to sort of make my way into and feel comfortable in at, where I was at that point. And then I started blogging, which I just did. I mean, it's sort of hard to explain. Like 10 years ago, blogging wasn't something that you did as a strategy. It was just sort of a random thing that I started doing, and it, got a lot of attention, somewhat to my surprise, and I just went from there. But obviously, since then, I have written for print. I have relationships with editors in a lot of print publications, but every single one of those relationships, directly or indirectly, came because of my internet writing, I would say. But does that answer your question, or do you want to know more about the logistics of writing for each venue?
Maybe about the logistics of writing for the internet. And I'm also curious as to, so you just kind of you just did it, like nobody. I don't know.
Yeah, I just did it.
Awesome.
Yeah, I just totally was like, yeah, okay,
Cool.
here's this, and I'm just going to do this.
Nice.
And I would encourage you guys to think about doing that kind of thing. If you see sites that you love, and it seems like it's run by people you have some aesthetic or creative kinship with, approach them, tell them what you like, send them your stuff, because I think that's a good way to form relationships really naturally with people. I do write a little bit differently when I'm writing, say, for the New York Times Magazine. Depending on the space I'm writing for, I just turned in a piece that's about 1,800 words, and it's for a spot, and I know sort of what kind of format they're looking for. I've written for the editor before, so I proposed this idea to him because I thought it would fit in that space and I would be able to do it pretty naturally. I also write a teeny, teeny, tiny thing every week for the New York Times Magazine that I usually turn it in, and it's about 65 words, and it usually gets cut down to about 50. And that's, there's a lot of compromise there. Right? And then, writing a book review, which, as I've said, I'm not really writing book reviews so much anymore, just because I think there's a lot of value in book reviews. I think that some people do them really well. I think that people, when they're well done, people like them because they can sort of get a sense of maybe whether this is something they would want to read read, but I feel like that form, for the most part, is just something I'm kind of not interested in engaging with anymore. So I'm really babbling. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about picking the novel as opposed to, say, maybe writing a memoir? Because it seems like a lot of your work is really focused on it.
Well, it's true. My work, and I've actually written a lot on my blog about the fact that the struggle with writing this novel has been moving it further and further away from my life. The more that I can move it away from my life, I think the better it gets. And so actually a lot of this is not true, but it is very much taking different elements of my life that feel resonant to me and maybe exaggerating something or changing something, but sort of maintaining, this may be a simplistic way to write, but I'm a feeling-driven fiction writer, and so I've just always had the feeling that the particular emotions and ideas that I wanted to convey through the emotions would really only be possible in fiction. But obviously, I mean, if you've read my stuff, I have no problem like sharing all kinds of crap about my life on the internet. So, so it's not a shyness. And a few years ago, I wrote a piece for the LA Times in which I feel like I was kind of in a weird mood, and I said some negative things about memoir that I think were more negative than I meant them to be, because I write memoir. I write short stuff. And I do like it when it's well done. What I don't like with the traditional memoir format is that it's often expected to have some sort of rousing conclusion in which everything is solved, and that's not the way I look at the world at all. And I sort of feel like if I were to write a book-length memoir, which again I don't want to do at this point, but if I did, I would kind of feel like, wow, you know what, actually, if I've spent X years writing this entire book about all of this stuff, I'm probably not all that over it, actually. So those were kind of my feelings about it. Anybody else? Yes?
When you first started your blog, did you do anything to like market it? I just feel like
No.
the internet's like such a big place, though. How did you
But it wasn't.
get it?
I know it's crazy to conceptualize like something so different, but it was tiny. I mean, the internet was huge, but the number of people writing about books and culture at that time was very small. And it's, I wish I could just like momentarily like move everyone back to that moment so you could see how just kind of, I'm a Gen Xer, it was like a total slacker thing to do. It's just like, well, I'm kind of working this job I don't really like, and I guess I'm like sort of gonna write, but there's this. It really was like that. Whereas now I think blogging is, I mean, the New York Times has blogs, the New Yorker has blogs, a lot of great literary publications have blogs. Full Stop is out there, I think they're great. New Inquiry is, doing some interesting stuff. LA Review of Books, none of that existed at the time when I started blogging. So it was just, and in fact, the people who were doing it were in some ways seen as like a real threat to the establishment, or like our very existence was sort of like perceived as an attack on the existing sort of critical apparatus and stuff. They were like, who are these people just like writing this stuff? So,
Right.
are you convinced? I feel like you look skeptical.
Well, I don't know. I mean, like, I guess now it just seems like, since there's, like you said, there's so many more people like using the internet for that sort of thing, I feel like now it's harder to get your stuff noticed.
Well, I think now, I mean, if I were doing it now, I think my natural impulse would be a little bit different, about how to approach it. I think that, if I were your age and I wanted to write on the internet, I might like have a Tumblr or Twitter or whether you like that sort of thing. I think that's really important. Don't go into a format that you don't like. And, and also, as I said, seeking out websites that feel like a place where you would feel comfortable, where your writing would be comfortable, and sending your stuff there, developing relationships with those people, because I think that the personal blog sort of way that I started out, that's not where the energy is online now. It's a totally different world, and I rarely update my own website now because I'm sort of looking at other stuff and writing for other places. Thanks a lot for coming out, you guys. Corey, thanks for that really thoughtful introduction. And Nellie and Gina, thanks.
A pack of gum from my mother's purse, and when she asked about it, pushed the wad I was chewing into my cheek. I woke in the morning to find myself home alone. Traffic had ceased, the yard stood empty of neighbors, and as thunder cracked and a hard rain fell, I wondered, had the graves of the faithful burst open? Had Jesus come in the night and swept my parents in the twinkling of an eye off to heaven? Was I left behind because I didn't repent in time? But soon runners sprinted into view, numbers on their chests, limbs slick with water, and I realized it wasn't, after all, the aftermath of the rapture. It was the day of the Coral Gables Marathon. My mother and father were still somehow married then, and we lived in an affluent Miami suburb incorporated as a separate municipality. I guess a rich people live here notice on the welcome sign would have been de classe, so local rules mandated an atmosphere of prosperity. Before painting your house, you needed a permit. Color chips had to be submitted along with the plans, and if your preferred shade was deemed too dark or too garish, or just generally out of keeping with the moneyed milieu, you would have to pick something else. Should any resident be gauche enough to own a pickup or van, there would also need to be a garage into which the vehicle could vanish by sundown, or it would be ticketed, then towed. Police patrolled the streets every night, alert to the slightest disturbance, parking violation, or errant garbage pile. My address was a frequent stop. My mother was notorious. It's a wonder, she would say, each time a cop strode off after shutting down a Bible study, that we don't have to follow a dress code. She'd grown up poor, raised in Dallas by a single backcountry Texan woman, and though with the aid of a rich stepdad's money, she had risen to become president of her college sorority and then married a lawyer, it amused her to flaunt her down-to-earthness. Before she got saved and started her own church, Mom's sole entertainment was doing things, such as building a stray cat coop in our backyard that horrified the neighbors. For months, we'd fed the feral encampment, taken them to be sprayed and vaccinated, nursed their kittens, coddled and petted any who would allow it, occasionally giving one away, and then my father found the tower of wooden boxes and tore it down. Some of the cats managed to hide under nearby bridges or beneath other houses. The rest were caught and wound up at the pound. I was 6 then. For days I cried and searched for the stealthier kittens, but over the years I saw them only as streaks of black, of white, of marmalade in neighboring yards. In some ways, all this was a repeat of my parents' courtship, when my father had demanded that Mom get rid of all but 3 of the 32 cats she had in her 2-bedroom apartment before he'd marry her, but she was not compliant this time. Turning her attention from animals, she began to minister instead to stray people. When my father commanded her to disband that group, she laughed in his face. I adored her for that. Our house was a pale yellow mid-century ranch with a terracotta roof and terracotta planters and heavy Bahama shutters painted a terracotta color that hung over the windows and made the front rooms dreary, but could be latched down in a hurricane. Kumquat trees ringed the drive, producing small sour oranges that fell to the ground, split open and rotted, so that we were fined for failure to keep up the yard. But from a distance, set against overgrown shrubs of dancing fire hibiscus, the fruit seemed like ornaments hung to complement our color scheme. A harvest goddess statue that my parents had picked out together and now argued over stood next to the garage amid the flowers. David, the Venus, de Milo, the goddess Athena, reproductions of classical sculptures proliferated on our streets as relentlessly as plastic lawn flamingos forbidden by our city council did in the rest of Miami. Behind our lot ran the Coral Gables waterway, which divided the yard from our neighbors and was filled with exotic creatures, turtles, sea cows, and according to lore, the very occasional lost shark or intrepid alligator. Dug out of limestone in the 1920s, the canal originally served as a channel for gondoliers ferrying pleasure seekers from the nearby Biltmore Hotel out to the bay. Now it was a throughway for rowboats and paddle boats and for all manner of motorboats, perilous company for the manatees that floated at the surface, the crests of their humps difficult for the captains to distinguish from logs and other debris until the propeller was within slashing distance. The water at its center plunged to depths of 40 feet, but closer to the edge you could see the bottom. There in twos and threes swam needlefish, long, thin, gunmetal-colored creatures with noses that looked like they could prick you and draw blood. During low tide, a little island appeared next to the seawall and was soon covered with tiny holes as miniature crabs dug their way out and skittered over each other. And there were ducks. To summon the squadron, you only had to appear in the backyard with a bag of stale bread, and the birds would converge from every direction and climb up on the dock, rasping and shitting with excitement. These were tropical specimens, muscavies, tall and aggressive, mottled black or filthy white or some unholy patchwork, and they had long claws, wide, flat tails, and lumpy red faces that made them look like escapees from a burn victim aviary. As you pulled a crust from the cellophane and prepared to fling it, 3 or 4 of them would race forward, wings flapping, and seize your fingers and the food at once. Having your hand attacked like this didn't hurt exactly, but it was alarming. The ducks gobbled their meal, swallowing it around your flesh before you could jerk away, and you had the sense that they wouldn't have flinched at gulping you down too if they'd had the jaws and the plumbing for it. Repulsed but fascinated by their naked greed, I fed them as often as possible. It had never been unusual for me to be left home alone without a note, phone call, or anything to eat but ice cream sandwiches. But the day of the marathon, watching the runners stream by in the pouring rain, I couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. Thunder boomed, then boomed again. The world through the windows became a rushing watercolor. Lightning crackled so close it sounded like someone tearing a curtain in half. I retired to the kitchen to dip a straw into Kool-Aid mix, an improvised pixie stick, often my lunch when I was left alone like this. Finally, the clouds lifted and dispersed, revealing the sun now high in the sky, which beat down on the sodden athletes. The humidity unleashed was so thick and so instantaneous, you could see a haze rising from the street as the runners lurched and wheezed. I went out back where the canal was now peaceful and sparkling. Here and there were the small bumps of sea turtles' heads. Butterfly bass leapt up, fleeting arcs of silver and gold, and then fell back in. A lone manatee poked his fat whiskered face above the surface, and then, like the fish, disappeared below. Across the way, ducks swam through the reeds, dipping to snap at minnows or algae or garbage or whatever they ate in the wild. One piebald drake bobbed down next to something caught in the vegetation along the far seawall, a long and bulky figure that, as I walked out to the dock for a better view, looked increasingly, then alarmingly, then undeniably humanoid. It was a woman bobbing face down on the water. Her hair streamed forward in the current. Air caught in her dress formed a grotesque balloon at the back of her thighs. Thanks. So I think I'm supposed to ask if you guys disheartening existence sometimes, I think, for people. And so I think writing enthusiastically about work you love is a really great way to make relationships. Doesn't always happen, but if it's genuine and enthusiastic, people a lot of times will get in touch. Yes.
I want to know how your reviewing, like writing reviews and all that kind of stuff affected your own creative work. If it ever made you kind of like paranoid not to do this, or if you found that it helped you and brought you inspiration.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I should back up for a second. Corey said that I'm a full-time writer, which is sort of true. I mean, I do write full-time, but I have a day job, which is writing about legal stuff. So there's the time problem of reviewing and balancing my own writing, which is its own sort of set of difficulties. But I think in some ways it's been very helpful to me. In some ways I feel like I've really gotten a sense of, what I'm trying to do and what sort of books I see as kin to my own writing, even if I can't write that well. But I'm not really reviewing very many contemporary novels right now. And I'm really only writing now about books that I feel in one way or another a kinship with, or, I do write some criticism also, especially cultural criticism, and so that sort of stuff sometimes, if something is annoying me, then I'll write about that, sometimes through the lens of a book. But yeah, I feel like it works really well for me if I trust my instincts and I write about stuff I'm passionate about, and if I don't sort of try to feel like I have to have some set of criteria that I'm imposing and, some sort of objective truth about whether this work is good or not. Does that make any sense to you? Yes.
Do you feel that going to law school affected the way that you write creatively reviews, writing fiction, and how do you feel that affected?
I think it did. I mean, for a while after law school, I really couldn't write creatively at all. And in part that was because I was working law firm hours. That was for a very short time. But in some ways, I think that it, my father is a lawyer actually, and so I think that I'm not close with him, but I think that I sort of already had a certain amount of instruction and just sort of intuitive ways of approaching the world filtered through that kind of way of being. And so I think this is sort of vague, but I think it helped me in certain ways, but I also think that it has been a challenge sometimes to step away from that kind of more analytical approach and just really let my writing be what it needs to be creatively, if that makes any sense. Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk about publishing and writing on the internet, especially as opposed and how it's different from sending out a manuscript to be put in a book or.
Sure. I mean, as you probably gathered, I started out on the internet, partly because I was too afraid, really, to start out any other way. I did send out a few stories. Sometimes I got, nice rejection notes back, but sometimes I got really mean ones. And my first, the first story